The sight of people walking, driving, or playing in floodwaters is a source of great frustration for the emergency services. Time and time again, we see people risking their own lives and the lives of others by ignoring the warnings. With populations in flood-prone areas growing and the frequency and intensity of flood events increasing, flood safety has never been so important. For community engagement and communications personnel such as Katie Moulton from New South Wales SES, finding ways to connect with people around flood safety is a constant challenge.
Jamison Town near Penrith, our chopper spotted driver after driver pushing through flooded roads.
Drivers have been bombarded with messages not to drive across flooded roads, but over and again, this at Howards Creek at the base of Tambourine Mountain, trucks and four-wheel drives powered through the runoff.
Katie, who is a Community Capability Officer in the Metro Zone of New South Wales, is on her way to meet Associate Professor Mel Taylor, whose research with the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC has led to a far better understanding of the psychology behind people's responses to floods and warning messages. Katie is keen to show Mel areas of the Hawkesbury that were affected by flooding in March 2021. The floods are fresh in Katie's memory, and they created plenty to think about in terms of community engagement and messaging.
Every few minutes another road closure as the water levels rose. Farms are isolated as waters lapped at the edges of Windsor, Richmond and Pitt Town.
So you've had some pretty significant flooding in this area. What sorts of things have you seen the community doing?
Yeah, well, we had what's about somewhere between a 1 in 10 and a 1 in 15 flood. But for a community, I guess, that hasn't seen flooding for a number of years, they're saying, you know, we haven't seen flooding like this for about 30 years. It was a pretty significant event. So there was a whole range of, of experiences had by different people. Quite a lot of shock, I guess, and people who were, very unfamiliar with having to think through what it means to be living in a floodplain. Evacuating, having to prepare your house to leave.
Katie is taking Mel to Katie Creek Bridge, a crossing that is frequently flooded during rain events and a hotspot for flood rescues.
So this is Katie Creek here.
And so what happened in this area?
So we typically get quite a few flood rescues through here. The water pops up and takes out the road. There are flood warning signs, lights on both sides and the barricades, but we still seem to find that people will drive through here.
During the March 2021 floods, Katie Creek Bridge was the scene of a fatality after a driver entered the floodwaters and couldn't escape. This is a sobering reminder to both Katie and Mel that more needs to be understood about flood safety in order to avoid such tragedies in the future.
One thing that came out of our research that surprised me was that when we asked people, some of the reasons they drove through floodwater, it was some of the things that you know already and that we've just discussed around, knowing the road well, having a long detour to take if you decide not to drive through the floodwater. And I thought we'd get lots more people saying that they had driven through floodwater before they even realised they were on it, so they may have come down the road here and just suddenly come across it and been in it before they could do something.
Yeah.
But we found that a lot of people were saying that they'd carefully considered the situation, which to me suggested that they had looked at the situation, they'd thought about it at least fleetingly, and then decided they were going to take the risk. And I could see that as being, I was surprised because it wasn't the sudden impulsive, we're in it, we've got no decision, but it also was the fact that from a communications point of view, if there is some decision making going on, that means that the communication that you're doing, communication I'm trying to inform, is going to be have an opportunity to cut through potentially at that point. In a warning, you have only a few words, and so, you know, if it's flooded, forget it is often the phrase that's used in this context, which is clear and concise and great as a warning, but it has a few problems associated with it. One is that it's telling you what not to do, which is, you know, generally not where you want to begin. You want to be giving people indications and positive messages about what they can do. But of course, in these situations, it's really hard to give any clear and concise indication of what you should be doing. It's fraught with problems for communicators, especially those who are in the emergency services, who really have to be very cautious about public safety. As a researcher, it's interesting because in other forms of communication where we have more words, we perhaps have more opportunities to, I guess, expand on some of this and try and look for reasons why people should consider or reconsider their behaviour and why this might be dangerous. But added to that, and again a challenge for communication, we found that in 90% of cases, just over 90% of cases, people got through and there were no consequences, no negative consequence. They got through, there was no damage to the vehicle, they didn't have to be rescued. And that makes it really difficult because if it's something that they do often, they know the road well, they usually get away with it. It makes it really hard for emergency services to give a very firm, this, you know, you must not drive through floodwater, never drive through floodwater, because it doesn't bear any resemblance to their normal, you know, experience. We also found in the information about the outcomes of driving through floodwater, we found that around 0.7% of people who drove through floodwater needed any kind of rescue from emergency services. So again, it you know, no surprises, but it gave us a number about to guide us on how unlikely it was that people would be driving through floodwater needing rescue.
Katie wants to find out more about how people behaved around floodwaters and responded to flood safety messaging during the March 2021 floods. So she's meeting Kevin Jones, Hawkesbury SES unit commander and local to the area, to find out what he observed during the event.
Lots of people in the area are very self-sufficient. They do their own thing and they have their own ways of telling when they think a flood's going to come and that sort of thing. And I'm sure that some of the warnings that get put out, they take notice of that, but a lot of people are very resilient and self-sufficient, and they go looking for their own sources of information to just double check that what they're hearing is correct on the media or wherever they get their information from. So.
And did you see in this event people driving through floodwaters?
We did see people driving through floodwaters. I personally saw that in a couple of different areas, mostly people going about trying to get their stuff either in or out off an island. But you know, it's definitely the end result of the damage to the roads, and that you can see that it's a very risky thing to do. So, but you do see people doing it. So.
Kevin's observations of people weighing up the risks associated with driving through floodwaters against the perceived benefits gained from saving animals, stock or assets really underlines for Katie the complexity associated with flood warning messages. It also highlights the trade-offs that emergency managers must make when encouraging community members to take greater responsibility for their own safety, when it's clear that people will frequently take calculated risks.
In my discussion with Kevin, who is a local, he was talking about how resilient the community are, and we know the community are resilient, and he said a lot of the reason why people enter or drive through floodwater is because they're going about their day. That just really struck a chord with me, that here we are thinking that it's, you know, naughty or childish behaviour, or people are going out of their way to do the wrong thing, when really, is it a sign of a resilient community? These are people who are going about their day, they're trying to get on with their life, they're getting back to their home, they're wanting to start the clean-up process, they may be going to check on pets or check on their house. So there's a whole range of reasons why people would travel through floodwater.
She'd ridden a motorbike over to check on cattle. Moments later, the creek had risen a metre.
Normally it's pretty slow going, the water rises pretty slow and goes down pretty slow as well, and so for it to go up within like seconds, it was like, wow, I've never seen that before.
It is really tricky because as a researcher, I could sit here and say what I would want to do is to sit down with people and to talk in more words, if you like, and explain what some of the dangers are and challenge some of those views that people have about how benign driving through floodwater is. But if I were in the emergency services, you know, you can't afford to say to people, it's okay to drive through sometimes, but not other times. But that is fraught with problems for emergency services and for those responsible for public safety.
Susan Davey from the Victorian State Emergency Service has been grappling with the nuances around flood warnings and using the learnings from Mel's research to design more sophisticated warning messages and approaches.
So taking on board some of the information that's been published by Mel and her team, it can really help guide our thinking on how we can be more nuanced in the way we communicate with the community, especially regarding the very dangerous activity of driving on flooded roads. What we've tried to do is incorporate some short, sharp messaging that's not negative, that actually provides some information that can help people make the decision not to drive on the road. We've developed a key messages document that we use in that multi-agency environment to ensure that everybody who's communicating with an emergency during a flood event has the right information. We hope that when people encounter the floodwater, it's something that prompts their thinking and can help their decision making. We also highlight the important message of thinking about alternative ways to evacuate so that people think, I don't need to drive through the floodwater, I can actually find another way around.
Katie has had some time to reflect on her meetings with Associate Professor Mel Taylor and local resident Kevin Jones, and feels that her deeper understanding of the psychology that underlies people's behaviours around floodwaters will be of real benefit to her and her team when it comes to community engagement and messaging.
So in talking with Mel today, I really started to think about the fact that the research is showing us that people enter floodwater for a range of reasons, and I think that's going to make me think differently around how I craft that messaging. It's not just careless, thoughtless, you know, decisions that are made at the moment. The research is showing us that people are actually putting a lot of thought into, you know, the reason why they need to enter floodwater, and almost that there may be a dismissive element to this, that when we do communicate, you know, don't drive through floodwaters, if it's flooded, forget it, that they are actually disqualifying themselves because they have another motive or a legitimate reason in their thinking to why they need to actually enter that floodwater. You know, and when you dive into the statistics of the research around fatalities in flood, you understand that it's, you know, a high consequence but low probability, and so, you know, 90% or even higher of people who do drive through floodwaters actually get through the other side and there's no consequences to their actions, which really clouds the messaging and makes it more complex for us. So this is certainly something we need to continue to have discussions about. We need to continue to research and to understand and to work through ways that we can better connect and communicate with people.